Welcome back to the California Conversation. I'm Tess Abraham. With everything going on around the world, most notably between the United States and Iran, we are hearing a lot about peace through strength. This is a common refrain among conservatives for how to best conduct foreign policy and how to keep the world largely peaceful. But could this principle apply to us here in California as well? Is this a universal idea of successful leadership and deterrence, not just from foreign enemies abroad, but here in California domestically too? We are breaking it all down today. But before we get started, make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell so that you stay up to date on all things California politics. And if you want more information or you want sources cited in compiling today's episode, then you should check out the corresponding article on my website, which is linked below. So the world is currently exploding, and there are some important principles that we need to understand, not just for the implications of federal policy and foreign policy, but also for domestic policy and here in California as well. And so I want to start by defining what this overall idea of peace through strength is, because you may be hearing a lot about it. It has been a flagship of President Trump's administration, and specifically with how he interacts with other countries. And so I think it's important for us to understand what he means when he says peace through strength, and then to apply it here in California. Now, this is the idea that visible power on the world stage, specifically, is going to deter aggression. And really, this is basic common sense. It means that if you show that you are capable, but also willing to use force, then that means that your enemies are less likely to try to push the boundaries or challenge you. And this is the idea that America does not just play a defensive role. It's the whole reason that President Trump changed the name of the Department of Defense over to the Department of War, because instead of being on the defense, the Trump administration has promoted the idea that we instead are on the offense. So we don't just react to attacks that are done to America, but we are also proactive in the world to try to make sure that we are deterring future attacks from happening even just in other countries. And so strength prevents conflict before it even starts. Demonstrated power has the ability to prevent war because, again, your enemies are less likely to try to stir something up or to provoke you if they know that you are willing and capable and stand ready to use great force against them. And so a stronger America, an America that is willing to show force even in times of relative peace, will then make sure that that peace just continues to abound in the future. So why is this coming up now? Well, I think it's fairly obvious that this all ties into what is happening currently between the United States and Iran. And I just want to clarify, I don't cover foreign policy. I don't talk about national politics. That is not going to be the focus of today's episode or any episode. There are so many other smarter commentators who cover all of those topics, and so you can check out their work. But I just want to point out that where peace through strength comes from is on the federal policy, foreign policy front. And so regardless of if you agree with what's happening in Iran, regardless of if you agree with the Trump administration, we can see that this is a very clear example of the core principle of peace through strength. We see that there was a visible willingness by President Trump and by others like Secretary Marco Rubio and Pete Hegseth to decisively act on the world stage in defense of freedom, in the defense of democratic values, and in the defense of American interests. And so many conservatives, again, regardless of where you fall on this issue, because there is some dissent, but many would agree that in general, demonstrating resolve, demonstrating credibility, demonstrating force and power actually is going to produce more stability than if we are demonstrating cowardice, than if we demonstrate hesitation or some sort of indecisiveness. And so while I may not be covering the foreign policy implications, what I want to do is pay attention to patterns that are happening across all of politics and then see how we can apply them here in California. Because governing philosophies don't just stay in one area of our government, they tend to travel, and we have to be able to recognize if they are good or bad and if we want to adopt them in our state or if we want to ignore them altogether and go a different direction. protection. And peace through strength is one of those governing philosophies. It's not just about how we come across to other nations on the world stage. It's also about how we govern here at home. And so actually making the cost of wrongdoing so clear and so evident in your government, even on a state level, is going to then deter all sorts of outcomes of evil or wrongdoing that you don't want to see. Now, where am I going with this for California? Well, California doesn't conduct foreign policy, although Governor Newsom tries to or thinks that he wants to. But we don't conduct foreign policy, but we do conduct criminal justice policy. And when it comes to criminal justice, when it comes to crime, we have seen a shift in California away from a sort of peace through strength model, and instead toward a model that says that we are not going to be consistent in our use of force or in our enforcement of the law. And that has led to a massive breakdown in not only our laws, not only our criminal justice system, but just in daily life for you and me living in our state. Because deterrence, again, doesn't just apply to hostile nations, it also applies to people who live in your state. And so if we don't enforce the laws, then criminals watch that. They see the signals that our justice system is sending them, and they see, what more can I get away with? How can I push boundaries further and further, knowing that I won't be punished here in this state? And so enforcement or a lack of enforcement is going to have consequences. It's going to create change, and it's going to change the lives of the people who live in your state, whether for the better so that they feel safer, or for worse because crime is actually incentivized. And so if we make sure that sentencing actually has meaning, we make sure that when someone goes to prison and they're given a life sentence, that they actually carry out a life sentence, then all of a sudden what you've done is that criminals see that, and they see that it is a much higher risk endeavor for them to break the law. But once again, if you don't do those things, then they know that they can probably get away with more than what you're willing to say that they can get away with, and they're willing to push the boundaries. And so I have talked about on the show, I have alluded to the idea that California has drifted away from enforcement of the law. And I have specifically said that criminals are not even arrested or prosecuted, that if they are convicted, that their sentencing is light, that even if they get a long sentence, that often they can walk away without carrying out that sentence. And I usually speak in broader terms. I have a few episodes on our criminal justice system and on crime, but there was a story coming out of California last week that was so horrific and so important that I could not ignore it. And it speaks to these very principles. It is a real life, tangible example of the decline that we've seen in California when it comes out to carrying out criminal justice. And so we have to look at it today. It is so important that you know that this is happening so that you don't have to just feel like you make unsupported claims that California is soft on crime. No, we see it happen every day, and it's important for us to highlight when it is happening so that we can learn from it and we can continue to persuade others around us that we need to change from it. And so, what is this horrific story? You might have heard of it, but it is the story of David Allen Funston. Now, this is a man who was convicted of 16 counts of kidnapping and child molestation in Sacramento County back in 1999, and he has been serving his sentence in prison ever since. The judge at sentencing said that his case was so horrific, so heinous, that he was, quote, the monster that parents fear the most. So this was an absolutely terrible person. And it is so important that we don't gloss over the details of his crimes or his story. And just as a disclaimer, if you happen to watch this show with children around, I just want you to know that some of the details that we will talk about really are horrifying and are not good for younger ears to be hearing. And so maybe just put in headphones for this one or watch it alone this time. So I just wanted to warn you about that. Now, his story starts in the summer of 1995, and it takes place specifically in North Highlands, which is a suburb of Sacramento County. He moved originally from Colorado to California, and later law enforcement found out that Funston had moved because he was convicted of sexually assaulting a woman in Colorado when he lived there. And so he moved to California really for a clean break. But unfortunately for us and the families of North Highlands, he just shifted his victim base from being older, from being more his age, down to children, because he thought that they would be a lot less likely to actually be able to identify him to law enforcement or be able to turn him in for his crimes. And so what he did was really the very classic example that we learn about as children from our parents to watch out for. He would lure children to his car using common tactics like candy, using Barbie dolls, just anything that he thought that children would be interested in. And then he would kidnap them and he would assault them. And it was found out that through the course of his crime spree that he kidnapped and assaulted 6 girls and 1 boy in total. So just completely horrific. So many lives were affected by this man. And again, I want us to not just gloss over this, because it is very easy to hear about crime and just think that's horrible, but we're kind of desensitized to it. We're kind of like, oh, that happens. We know that it's really bad, but we don't really sit in it and think about it. But again, all of the law enforcement and all of the judicial system that was involved in this case marked Funston as one of the worst monsters, as one of the most terrible people that they had ever seen. In fact, the district attorney who was prosecuting Funston, so a district attorney is someone who sees a lot of crime and prosecutes a lot of people. But this DA noted that, quote, "This was probably the worst child predator case I have ever seen or ever prosecuted." That is saying something if it is the worst that a DA has seen. And so we need to take that incredibly seriously. She cites that he would lure children as young as 3 or 4, so tiny little kids, over to his car. And when he would kidnap them, he would commit acts of extreme violence against them. For example, she says that there was a case of him kidnapping a female child, beating her so severely, and then stuffing her underwear down her throat because, quote, "she was screaming so much." And this has left lifelong impacts on these victims. They have spoken out even recently against Funston for the severity of his crimes. One victim who was kidnapped and abused by Funston when they were just 3 years old said, quote, "He is a very horrible person. He took innocence from myself and others." Another victim who was 4 years old when victimized by Funston said, quote, "He shouldn't be breathing the same air that we are breathing at all. That man is a monster." Now, the reason that Funston was caught at all was because in one of his last acts of trying to lure 2 children to his car, a neighbor in the community saw him attempting to do that, wrote down his license plate information, and contacted police. And so because of that, Funston was arrested, he was prosecuted, and he was subsequently sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences in prison. And that was intended to keep him in prison indefinitely. Now, I just want to pause here. We are not going to get into the entire idea of capital punishment, but I do want to say that something right off the bat is deeply broken if our state will not even consider capital punishment for the crimes of a man who kidnapped and sexually assaulted multiple young children so severely that it would leave them traumatized for the rest of their lives. That is a complete breakdown of justice. And so automatically 3 life sentences is not enough. The type of harm, the type of evil that he committed against these innocent children is condemned by God and should be condemned by our justice system. But with that said, Funston was ultimately sentenced to life in prison. And at the time, law enforcement, the justice system, they thought this was enough. They thought certainly he will be in prison forever. And in fact, the Sacramento Bee reported at the time, Funston will die before he ever gets a parole hearing. And so everyone thought, this is over. This is great. Law enforcement did its job. The justice system worked correctly to put this monster behind bars, and we don't have to fear him again. And so we would be tempted to think, well, we can just move on. This is a very sad story. It does unfortunately happen. There are terrible people out there, but this is why we have the laws that we have in place in order to protect the community and in order to put bad people behind bars. But unfortunately, just at the end of last year, and then even as recent as last week, we are seeing that this is not the case because of changing laws in our state and shifting priorities and policies. In September of last year, a board of parole hearings granted Funston elderly parole, which means that he would be released from prison after serving 20 plus years of his sentence, to live out the rest of his sentence in the community with some limitations of parole. And so Governor Gavin Newsom, to his credit, said that this decision needed to be reviewed. And so this underwent review. And it's just last week that a decision was made by the full parole board, and they actually affirmed the decision to grant elderly parole to Funston. And so this decision is going to stand. This monster, this person who has been described as one of the worst criminals, the most heinous men, is set to be released from California State Prison to go back into our communities. And yes, he will have a parole officer, but he will be able to live out his life in the community doing as he pleases. And so you are probably wondering, as I was when I read the headline about this, how is this allowed to happen? How is such injustice allowed to be done? How could anyone prioritize the release of a criminal who committed these types of crime into the community over protecting the communities that are currently in place, as well as just enacting justice in having him continue to serve out his sentence? What happened? What broke down? What went wrong? Well, it all comes down to these soft on crime policies that I allude to here week after week, because it always comes down to laws, because laws have real implications on life. And so how exactly did this happen? Well, California has something called an elderly parole program. And basically what this says is that once an inmate is over 50 years old, if they have already served 20 years of the sentence that they were given, then they immediately are able to be given consideration for parole. And so they are given a hearing. And what's interesting is that these parole hearings don't consider their guilt or their innocence. Instead, they just consider the potential risk that they pose to the community if they were to be released on parole. And so they tried to see if that risk would be unreasonable. And apparently, California, in its parole boards, decided that a man who committed these types of crimes against innocent children multiple repeated times after a pattern of violence and sexual assault before moving to California, apparently releasing that kind of person into our community does not pose an unreasonable risk, which again highlights the rot, the moral rot that has taken place, not only in our legislature, not only in our laws that are in place here in California, but in the judicial system, in the very people who are in charge of trying to protect communities and trying to enforce the law. And so it's important to understand, why was this type of system put in place? Why is it that once you're 50 and have served 20 years, you might be in prison for a terrible crime, but it's just automatically that you get to be assessed for parole? Well, let me tell you, surprise, surprise, this is all once again because of prison overcrowding. So California had a prison overcrowding problem where there are just too many inmates in state prisons, and they needed to deal with it. And the way that they decided to deal with it was not by keeping the burden on the state to build more prisons, to consider something like capital punishment. Instead, their idea was, how can we release more criminals? Who are the criminals that we think are less risky? And maybe that's older people. Maybe once you're 50, you're less of a risk to the public. And so we'll just say you get to be let out on parole. Absolutely disgusting. So instead, the public is now taking on that burden. The risk is falling to us. It's falling to our communities. It's falling to me and you to assume the risk of absorbing these types of criminals back into our societies, back into our neighborhoods, back into being around our children. And so, shifting back to the argument that I made at the top of the show, peace through strength actually demands some sort of consistency and credibility. It says that when you hand down consequences, you have to actually carry them out for people to take you seriously. But what kind of message does it send in our state when a man convicted with 3 consecutive life sentences because of how bad his crimes were? What does it say when we let a man like that walk freely or just walk on something as flimsy as parole in California. What do you think other criminals are going to assume about California when they see that? How do you think that is going to impact our state? Is it going to make our state more peaceful, more safe, knowing that justice will actually be enacted? Or is it going to do the exact opposite? And so this case is important to understand, not just isolated in itself, but as realizing that it represents a greater pattern of what has happened in California, of the decay that has happened over the past decades in our laws and in our leadership. Because this one case is not alone. There are so many other cases like it, and we read stories like this every single day. And if we're reading stories about this case, which was so heinous, think of the many stories that are never told because maybe they don't rise to the same exact level as this. And yet, still, criminals are being allowed to walk free under programs just like this one, the elderly parole program, because California has shifted its priority. Its priority is not to enact justice. It is not to secure safety for the people who live here. It's not to reduce wickedness and actually punish the evildoer, which is the very role of government. It is literally its primary responsibility handed down to it by God through the authority of the Bible. It is not focused on that anymore. It is focused instead on this toxic empathy that says we are going to feel more for people who are sitting in prison because of terrible crimes they have committed. And we are going to say that prison overcrowding is more of a problem than people who are actually committing the crimes, making sure that those people are punished, making sure that the children who live in our state will not be victimized in the future. And there are a few ways that California has done this. Obviously, we see that there are other pathways than just the elderly parole program. There are other pathways that have made this happen so that criminals can be released earlier based on good behavior, based on time served. And so criminals often are not serving their full sentence. But additionally, it's also showing that risk assessments are going to now replace moral judgment and moral clarity, because even in these parole hearings, the parole hearing could have shut this down. It could have denied this criminal actually being able to be let out on parole, but it didn't. And it didn't because it wasn't thinking about the moral weight of what he did. It wasn't thinking about the justice that had to be carried out against him. It was thinking about a risk assessment. It was trying to say, what risk does he pose today? That is a complete shift from what true justice seeks. And so we see again that our system is orienting toward reducing incarceration rather than restraining evil. And that cannot go unnoticed. It cannot go overlooked, and it cannot just be shoved away in the busyness of the news cycle, because this one case exposes the radical governing philosophy that California is pursuing, which is very anti to what we have seen in foreign policy of our federal government of trying to maintain peace through actual shows of strength instead of weakness and instead of cowardice. Now, thankfully, there is backlash to this decision, because how could there not be some sort of backlash and outrage? And so there are actually new charges being brought against Funston by Placer County. And the reason for that is he committed these crimes in multiple counties, but he was only convicted in Sacramento County. And at the time, Placer County said, well, because he was given 3 life sentences, because he will be in prison forever, there's really no need for us to also go after prosecuting and convicting him. And so we will not pursue the charges. However, because that is no longer the case, Placer County District Attorney said in a statement, quote, subsequent changes in state law and recent parole board failures have altered the practical effect of those life sentences for the victims and communities at large. When changes in the law put our communities at risk, it is our duty to reevaluate those cases and act accordingly. David Allen Funston committed very real crimes against a Placer County child, and the statute of limitation allows us to hold him accountable for those crimes. And so good on Placer County, good on their district attorney for pursuing this, because when there is massive injustice that is done like this, when our state laws and our very justice system completely fails us, then someone has to step in. Someone has to say, I will not stand with this. The buck stops with me. And so Thankfully, Placer County is attempting now to do that so that Funston should not be actually released from prison. However, that should not be the case for situations like this in California. This should not fall to certain district attorneys having to step up and say, okay, now I'll go after him. Now we'll file additional charges. That shouldn't be the case. The charges filed in the first place should have been enough, because the crimes he committed in the first place should have been enough for our state to intervene, to say you are an evil, heinous person and you are not able to live in society. You have proven that you are not safe to live in society. And so for the sake of your victims and for the sake of the rest of the people who live in our communities, you are not able to go back to living among them. You are in prison. Or again, there are stronger options available to us. Now, the district attorney who originally prosecuted Funston and who made all of those claims about what a monster he really is had just the most perfect response to everything that was going on. And so I want to read it to you because I think it's very revealing of how we need to be thinking about this case. She said, quote, "It's Gavin Newsom that signed the law that's allowing him to be released without having any exclusion for serial sex offenders. Any rational person thinks that a man that has kidnapped 7 little kids under the age of 7, done horrific things to them, that fantasizes about children and still continues to fantasize about them, because yes, Funston has admitted to that recently, should be kept in prison. Who thinks that this is a good idea to let this man out when he earned 3 life terms?" And that response is spot on, because yes, common sense and reasonable people would see the situation, and no matter your politics, no matter where you stand, would say, that is evil, that is wrong, he should not be let out of prison. He should not be able to potentially be able to victimize more people. And for the sake of his victims, he should be punished for how he victimized them, because the trauma and the horror that they experienced, which is just completely, you can't understand how horrific that is. I can't understand how horrific that is. That is not a light thing. That is not something that can just be brushed off by 20 years in prison. He deserves to serve the entirety of his sentence for what he did against them. But the point we should not miss in all of this, which was said so clearly and so wonderfully, is that Gavin Newsom, your governor and your legislature signed this law, enacted this law, passed it through the process and said that it would be a good idea. Your leadership allowed this and not allowed it. Your leadership made this type of situation happen. And so this means until we change the laws in our state around criminal justice, it means until we change the leadership in our state, this type of moral decay and decline of safety and justice in our state will persist. It will worsen, and it will eventually destroy the state of California. And so what is the point of all of this? What is the point of looking at this story? What is the point of trying to understand it in light of current principles that we're seeing play out in other parts of our government? The point is that this case is a breaking point. It is a turning point. It is a sign that we cannot continue down this path. And it is a breaking point in a year that Californians have some serious decisions to make about the leadership in their state, that they have decisions to make on propositions, that they have decisions to make on who is going to be able to propose and enact laws. And we need to take that seriously. We need to take that responsibility seriously. We need the people around us to understand how important, how weighty the upcoming midterm election really is. Sacramento County Sheriff Jim Cooper said it best when he has been responding to this entire case. He said, quote, "Elections are coming up. What do you stand for? Don't talk the talk, walk the walk. Protect our children." And so it is time to bring peace through strength to California's criminal justice system. This year, be ready, prepare to vote, to restore accountability, to restore moral clarity, and to restore trust that when California promises justice, that it will deliver it. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I hope it was helpful for you as you navigate life in our state, and that you even learned something new as you are thinking about the upcoming primaries and, of course, the November election. If you love this show, please spread the word and share it with your friends, family, and fellow Californians. And I'll see you back here next week for another episode of The California Conversation.